Welcome to the January 2016 OEM Server update for the Microsoft Australia OEM team. In this update, we'll be focusing heavily on the SQL Server 2005 end of support deadline, which is in April 2016. And as a background for this, we've already put up a lot of content on the Australian OEM team blog site, which I'll reference as we go through today's material. So if you do need references, a lot more background information, resources to go to your customers with to discuss the SQL Server 2000 end of support time period and the impact that can potentially have on your customers, please go to our blog site, which you'll find linked from the locations where you're watching this video, but we'll also have that at the end of the presentation as well. So make sure that you do check that out to get some of the latest resources that are available here. Then we'll move on to just a quick refresh of some of the new options, the new ways that you can get SQL Server 2014 via the OEM channel via ROK. So working with your OEM server manufacturers, you've got the ability now to go through and get SQL Server 2014 as part of a bundle with different versions of Windows Server. So we'll touch upon that, even though we did focus on that a couple of months back. Obviously now with the looming deadline for SQL Server, it's obviously a very important one. Then we'll just spend a moment talking about some upcoming events and wrap up with some of the important resources you should be checking on regularly. So let's jump in now and talk about SQL Server 2005 end of support. So if you weren't aware, SQL Server 2005 end of support is on April 12, 2016, so we're really not all that far away from it. But I guess the good news though is that we've already had to have some pretty big end of support conversations with customers over the last few years. For a lot of people, probably the really big one to start that conversation was the XP end of support timeframe, then moving on to the Windows Server 2003 end of support timeframe, and now we've also got the SQL Server 2005 end of support timeframe. So April 12, 2016. So approximately 3 months from when this video will get released. So one of the good things here is that there's probably a lot of synergy and interaction between your Windows Server 2003 upgrade plans and your SQL Server 2005 upgrade plans. And the message that you go out to customers with is a very similar message around, just the top lines being no security updates, potentially higher maintenance costs over time as you try to hide the issues as opposed to actually fixing the problems, and then moving on to what the compliance concerns can be with this. So in this slide, we've got a list of the different timeframes for the end of extended support for the next few versions of SQL Server as well. So you can see here that it really makes sense when you're talking to customers around end of support and migration plans, trying to put them in a situation where they can keep something running for as long as possible. And in this case, you can see that if you move to SQL Server 2014 as part of this migration, they've got ongoing support from Microsoft up until July 9, 2024. Whereas if the customer just wants to do a small jump and says, look, we just want to go to 2008 or 2008 R2, that's only going to buy them just over 3 years of additional support, at which point they're going to have to go through this entire process again. So this really points you towards making sure that customers do understand that there really are some big benefits of looking at SQL Server 2014, not just from the perspective of some of the enhancements to the capabilities that it has, which we'll talk about in some of the upcoming slides, but also in terms of making sure that they've got a platform that they can stay on for a longer time period and obviously benefit from those improvements as well. Now, all of the Microsoft support lifecycle information is available at support.microsoft.com/lifecycle, where it gives you this information. I've broken some of this information down into more detail on the Australian OEM team blog site as well, because the other things you need to think about in terms of these different support dates is the things like your SQL Express, your SQL Lites, etc., that may be distributed around the organization. So making sure that you do have those covered. Now, why should customers look at moving to SQL 2014 and away from SQL Server 2005? So first up, there are huge improvements in performance. There are big improvements in high availability and disaster recovery options with the always-on technology, where you can have multiple replicas available so that if you need to fail over, whether to another on-prem server or potentially even to a hosted server in Azure, for example, you've got the ability to do that. Now, other things that have occurred during the 2005 to 2014 release timeframe, the ability to really start scaling across the more advanced capabilities that Windows Server provides, as well as the underlying virtualization technologies that have also been enhanced significantly during that time period. Now, maintaining security and compliance should be top of mind for a lot of organizations in this, in this time period that we live in. It's very rare for too long to go by before you hear about types of attacks that have occurred, about botnets, about other security threats, about other approaches that people are taking to, attack technologies. And having a technology in place that sits there and is unprotected because it's not receiving updates is really just leaving the door open to allow these types of things to occur. And then finally, for optimizing data infrastructure, this is where things such as that virtualization story really start coming through even stronger. So how can you go through and take maybe a different approach to how you dealt with building out database servers in the past? Whereas in the past, you may have done it on physical servers, or you may have had to have, multiple servers just to handle a particular workload. Whereas now you've got different ways you can start addressing that, including some of the things we've mentioned, such as if you need some kind of cloud capability, the very easy way which you can start integrating using SQL Server management tools directly to integrate with the different Azure database options as well. So for the customers that are going to respond to, I don't really want to say the scare tactics, but I guess more the realities of what end of extended support means. Well, okay, the major one here that we've seen with Windows XP end of support, that we've seen with Windows Server 2003 end of support, is that there are no security updates. So this is obviously a very, very important one. And time after time, we hear some of the same messages from people around, well, I've been running product X for this amount of time and, it's been running fine. But the reason it's been running fine is because, you as the partner have been sitting there making sure it gets patched, making sure security updates are applied, doing the appropriate servicing, etc. Whereas a lot of the time the customers don't realize that these are things that are going on behind the scenes. So you need to make sure that customers are aware that there were many critical security updates that were made available while SQL 2005 was under extended support. Now, there won't be any further updates released after April 12, 2016, as we've discussed. And this is something that I think now we're at the point where people accept that once, these dates are hard dates, they're not dates that are flexible from Microsoft's perspective. And, just making sure that customers know that, this does apply now to SQL 2005. Now, with higher maintenance costs, one of the things that tends to come up when it's announced that something is end of support is when someone starts thinking about, well, what are my contingency plans if I do need to keep the old product running for longer? How can I do this in some kind of, I won't say supported manner because it's not something that is going to be supported by Microsoft. It might be something where the customer says, well, we're willing to run it this way, or you may say, look, this is what we have to do for now. So it might be something that you do as a short-term stopgap just to make sure that you can sort of keep the old system running while the new system gets rolled out. But sometimes people go overboard in terms of implementing advanced securities to really try to isolate that particular workload and keep it, removed from everything else on the network. But sometimes it's all too easy just for one simple mistake to then expose that and make it vulnerable. And at the end of the day, you're not actually addressing the issue. All you're doing is hiding the issue away. So if it's something where you do have plans to fix that, and it's something that you've got timeframes in place, etc., as opposed to a theoretical agreement with the customer that it may occur in the future, make sure that before you go down this path that you have addressed it so that you do have a proper strategy, a proper migration path to get them onto something that is actually supported. Now, with compliance concerns, depending on the industry that your customer is in, okay, it can be something that has major ramifications. So if all of a sudden you get to the point where they're not compliant with some of the standards that their industry requires, then that can really leave them in a situation where they may not be able to communicate with other organizations using the software tools that they've been used to. All of a sudden you may have to start switching providers, you may have higher fees associated with different types of transactions, etc. And these are all things that, over time start adding up, and it's just better to address the overall issue as early as possible rather than trying to deal with it after the fact, after you've already been hit with a bunch of these fees as well. So what are some of the customer upgrade motivations? So why should customers look at upgrading? Well, obviously the first one is this end of extended support. So this is really the one that should start conversations, even if the customer's not aware of it yet. Hopefully they are, because as I mentioned, we're only 3 months away. So if you're in a good situation, it means that you've probably already addressed a lot of these concerns. You're probably on the tail end of some of the projects. You've probably got some customers who are kind of dragging along a bit, saying, well, budget, this, that, doesn't it just work? But, getting them across is something that is important for the health of their internal IT infrastructure. Now, the next one, the enhanced SQL Server 2014 features and performance. We'll talk about that in upcoming slides. Okay, we just covered things like the impact on security and compliance. And with cloud strategy, this is something where you may be thinking, look, my customer's not planning on moving their database to the cloud. They need this stuff on-prem. Well, we're not necessarily saying move away from that. In this case, we're actually saying, well, look, use the on-prem, use what they're used to, upgrade them to SQL 2014, maybe in a virtualized machine and a new server. But when it comes to things like your disaster recovery plans, when it comes to having a replica of that database working elsewhere or a backup of that database off-site, this is where some of the cloud integration capabilities of SQL Server really do start providing a very, very different story around these scenarios than what you could do with SQL 2005. So what are some of the blockers that you'll get? So what are some of the things that you've probably already encountered or will encounter when you have these conversations with customers? So first up, ISV application compatibility. Now, at this point in time, there really shouldn't be ISVs who are running and selling current products who are saying, well, we can't move away from SQL 2005. It may be that the customer's got old versions of that vendor's application and they're not willing to move away from that old version, and that's a completely different conversation where all it really is signifying is that the customer is potentially having trouble justifying moving to this new version of that ISV's product. So what's the business value? What are some of the improvements that that overall application is going to bring? It might be that the ISV no longer exists, so the customer feels like they've been backed into a corner and they've got nowhere to move to. Now in this case, it's something where you've got a couple of different approaches. You may say, well, look, could we just try putting SQL Server 2014 in and replace SQL 2005, so at least you've got a supported database. Now in some cases that may be something that works, and if it's a scenario where the ISV isn't around to support that app, or it's a non-supported application because it's too old for the ISV anyway, you might still be in a position where at least you've got a supported database. So when it is time for you to upgrade to something else, at least you've got your database infrastructure up to date. Now, lack of business reason for upgrade, that's one of the things where people will go, well, things keep working. Why should we go through this process? Not realizing that there have been a lot of enhancements to SQL Server over the years, as well as these different third-party apps that rely on SQL Server, and we'll talk about some of those things coming up. Now, obviously, there are time and resource requirements when when you are planning on doing an upgrade. So making sure that you've got fallback plans, so the next point, when we upgrade, we break stuff. Make sure you've always got a fallback plan. Make sure you've got users who can test out the new environment and know that you can roll back to the old environment at the drop of a hat if absolutely needed. And when it comes to the licensing costs, well, some will argue that the cost of doing nothing can end up being a lot more than the cost of licensing again. Now, positive here with the licensing side is one of the topics we'll talk about shortly is SQL Server being available now through OEM ROK licensing means that you'll have some different licensing options there which may be more palatable to the customers, including OEM CALs for SQL Server. Now, as we go through the different revisions of SQL Server over the last 10 years or so, we've got SQL 2005 all the way to SQL 2014. And some of the big improvements around these versions that we've gone through have been things like improvements in business intelligence, huge improvements in reporting capabilities, some of the cloud integration technologies, as well as some really, really big performance enhancements. So, this is something that I won't go through all the points on this slide because it's really just a quick timeline to show customers that it is something that, a lot of additional capabilities have been added into SQL over time. Now, there is also a new version of SQL Server, SQL 2016, that's currently in technical preview. It doesn't have a release date just yet, so it's one of those things where I wouldn't really try to get customers sold on the idea of moving to that, because it could be something that gets released after the SQL 2005 end of support timeframe, which is again not a situation you want to be in. Now, if we take a look at some of the breakthrough performance capabilities here, this is just the overview slide. We'll talk about some of these in a bit more detail as we go through the next slides. But the three primary categories are mission critical performance. So how does SQL Server 2014 get better performance than its predecessors? What are some of the enhancements to the business intelligence capabilities? And when we talk about the overall data platform, what are some of the changes that have occurred that allow SQL Server to really start spreading its wings? So with the mission critical performance with SQL Server 2014, we've got 13 times performance improvements from the 2005 edition and 5.5 times the performance from the 2008 edition. And if you're using in-memory OLTP, up to 30 times gains from that as well. And with the OLTP, that's really where we're taking most commonly used tables, loading them into memory so that we're actually accessing them at memory speed as opposed to disk speed. So in some cases, if that's frequently used data, that can be something that has a huge impact on the performance. Now we've got high availability using technologies such as Always On, which has been, it was introduced with SQL Server 2012, but enhanced with more replica capabilities in SQL Server 2014. If your customer does need to have replicas of that database spread around different branches or different offices, both locally or globally. Now with security, it's the least vulnerable database for 6 years in a row. For the scalability, well, for this, these seminars we do tend to target SMB customers. So, we talk about enterprise scale when we talk about SQL Server, but all that really means is that it can scale up, but it also scales down as well to really make sure it meets the requirements of SMB customers. And then we've got manageability and programmability. So using common tools for management, using a lot of established programming tools to go through and interact with SQL, so that if people want to go through and start, integrating with the database itself through custom applications, it's something that has always been a strong point of SQL Server. Now, with the faster insights, the important thing here is being able to work with large databases, small databases, and using tools such as Excel to go through and do further analysis. So making sure that the Microsoft stack has got great integration with SQL Server. So, Excel obviously has got a lot of reporting capabilities. It's got a lot of dashboard type views. So making sure that these are things that work well with SQL Server is obviously a very, very high priority for Microsoft. Now, when it comes to the data platform investment, this is really all about looking at what the customer's requirements are, what they've been doing in the past, and what they may potentially need to be doing in the future. So the current plan may just be to do a rip and replace of SQL 2005 servers to SQL 2014. Now that could be physical servers or it could be virtual servers. It could be starting to then think about, well, what are some of these cloud features that we can benefit from? Even though we don't want to host the main database in the cloud, we may still want to make sure that we've got copies of it sitting there in case we need to switch over to those during times of maintenance or during times of high activity, for example. So how do we make that very, very easy? And then how do we use the same tools to go through and manage those instances, whether they're local or hosted in the cloud? Now, when it comes time to having the SQL Server 2005 conversation, well, a lot of this conversation probably started when you were having the Windows Server 2003 end of support conversation. So one of the things that was, one of the topics that we spoke about at length was, during the Windows Server 2003 end of support time period, and this is information from just under a year ago. So talking about how more than half of SQL Server 2005 instances were running on top of Windows Server 2003. So now that we know that a lot of that Windows Server 2003 has been migrated, there has been a lot of SQL 2005 that's also been migrated, but we know that there's still some SQL 2005 out there running on on Windows Server 2003, as well as later versions of Windows Server. But by upgrading together, you can go through and make it one big project for the customer rather than trying to do things in a piecemeal solution. Now, it's important to note that SQL Server 2005 isn't supported on Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2, so the customer will need to make sure that they do have an up-to-date operating system platform to run this on. Now, some people might suggest running SQL Server on Windows Server 2012 or 2012 R2, but apart from not being supported, you just don't know how it's going to behave. You may have problems, you may have performance issues, and these are things that Microsoft just cannot help you with. And by combining SQL Server with Windows Server 2012 R2, you can really take advantage of the latest hardware capabilities that both platforms can leverage. And then finally, for the ISVs, making sure that you're keeping your line of business applications, etc., running and supported. So if these are the lifeblood of your customer's business, obviously if you want to get paid, they have to have these things running so that they can get paid. So it's in everyone's best interest to keep these essential systems up and running. Now, as we take a look at the on-premises upgrade options, we've really got two different scenarios here. So for customers who really have to or want to run SQL Server as a direct install on Windows Server on physical hardware, or raw iron in the orange box here, you can go through and do that. But for a lot of people now, it makes a lot more sense to look at virtualizing this. So you've got the additional benefits that virtualization gives you. You start getting live migration type capabilities, etc. So why would you potentially choose physical? Well, it could be something where, if we take a look at Hyper-V, where in most cases we don't view this as a limit, but Hyper-V has got a limit of 64 of virtual CPU cores and 1 terabyte of memory per virtual machine. Now, if you've got a customer who's got database requirements that exceed those two metrics, then you may have to look at using physical servers for that. Now, that's really not what most SMB customers are doing with SQL Server. They're not running workloads that really need anything close to that. So in that case, I'd say, for most SMB conversations, it really should be a conversation around, even if it's currently on a physical install on an older version of Windows Server, looking at what can be done to virtualize it and, going through and testing it just to make sure that it does, match the requirements that the customer has. So what are some of the upgrade objections that you might find? Well, can't we do, just how about not doing anything because the application will eventually go away? Well, you're still running on an old version of SQL Server. So this is where someone is saying, well, we've got an old application, we'll just run it into the ground and then move across to something else. And it's like, well, you're not actually addressing anything that we've spoken about at all here so far. Now, can we move it to the cloud and leave it running? Well, 2005's not really, that's not really fixing anything. You still got an unsupported and SQL database infrastructure that's not going to be patched over time. And then sometimes customers will say, well, can we move to a competitive solution because of the maybe we're looking at moving anyway, but it's going to be quite a costly experience to go through and migrate the data across to another database. And even if that database may be compatible with some of the things that the customer needs to run, you'll probably find that it's not going to be anywhere near as compatible with a broad range of ISV software like SQL Server is. So what's the upgrade steps? So how do you get started with this whole process? So really three main steps that we break it down into. So first up is discovery. So discovering what SQL instances the customer has installed. So one of the main ways that we recommend to do this is using the Microsoft Assessment and Planning Toolkit. This is a free download. It's one of the Microsoft Solution Accelerators. It's a very small download, but it goes through and it will find all the SQL instances on things like your domain joined machines, for example. So not just your servers, but also ferreting out and rooting down amongst all the desktop machines, because you'll probably find there are still some old SQL instances installed there that have been installed by desktop applications, for example, or different types of tools the customers are using. So your SQL Express, your SQLites, that kind of thing. Now there's also the SQL Server Upgrade Advisor tool, which I've got a link to that in the accompanying articles for this video. So if you go to the OEM Australia team blog site, you'll find that information, and I'll give you the link to that at the end of this presentation. Now for targeting your destinations, well, really the two main ones we're talking about here are, both on-premises SQL Server installations. So either a physical installation or a virtual installation. And then finally, make the move. Now, for making the move, this might be something that you're not particularly comfortable with. If you've primarily been focused on deploying Windows Server, building out group policy, deploying desktop machines, doing day-to-day maintenance, etc., SQL may not be your thing. And for a lot of organizations, they'll say, look, we partner with someone who handles the SQL stuff or handles the ISV applications. And that's the same case here. Talk to the customer, find out who they're using, or talk to people in your area that are using similar software and find out who it is that they use that they're happy with to actually support these different workloads and the migrations that may be required. So now that we've spoken about some of the reasons why and how to do the migration, let's take a look at the SQL Server 2014 via the OEM channel offering. So this is something that started back in August of 2015, and it's available as part of a bundle with ROK versions of Windows Server Standard or Data Center, depending on what the customer requirements are. So what you get here is SQL Server 2014 Standard, and you get to choose whether you want to purchase that with Windows Server 2012 R2 Standard or Windows Server 2012 R2 Data Center. So how do you go through and sell this? Well, okay, the first step is making sure the customer actually needs SQL Server. So if they've got SQL 2005, okay, it's a good place to start. They need to start moving if they haven't already. Now you choose Standard or Data Center depending on what the customer's virtualization requirements are. Now I won't go into a lot of details here on this because we've covered it in depth in previous video recordings. So I'd say check through the archives of video to see what we've actually made available. But really here it's a matter of how many VMs, how many servers are really the two things that you need to start thinking about when it comes to when Data Center or Standard start making sense for the customer. Now, with Data Center, it's generally the more virtual machines the customer needs, the faster the Data Center conversation should be one that you have with them. Now, also importantly is that it's not just OEM server CALs for Windows Server that can be purchased through OEM. You can also purchase SQL Server OEM CALs as well. So getting everything through the same channel at the OEM discounted price. So what are the benefits for you as the partner for doing this? So the first one is the increased product and services revenue. So being able to go through, do the deployment, even if you're not doing all of the migration, at least doing the pre-work to get it set up so that someone else can come in and then do the migration and do the testing, etc. afterwards. It'll be subject to OEM incentives. So if you do already get incentives for OEM products through the different programs you're a member of, it will also assist you there. You can get the, we all know that when it comes to, attach, it's better if we can do an attach at point of sale. So in this case, if we can do SQL Server attach at point of sale as well as SQL Server CALs attach at point of sale, we end up with a much better, not just attach rate, but a much better, revenue per sale there as well. And then also we now get the OEMs supporting that SQL Server license as well. So it means that for you and for your customers, you've both got the OEM that you can contact for the support on those products. Now for the customer, the benefit here is it's a one-stop shop. They order one SKU, so simplified licensing starts making it a lot easier for them. So they're easier to deploy. We just covered that. So so you as the reseller or consultant can do this as part of the basic installation, that full support by the OEM. So instead of calling Microsoft support and being asked what their support details are and being charged for that, it's something where the OEM takes responsibility for the support requirements. And then the other benefit here is that because it's OEM licensing generally is available at better pricing than what you get for the other versions of products through volume license. So in this case, the customer can actually save some money. What if the customer's asking you about, well, should they be buying SQL Server via volume license? So, how is this product different? Well, volume license products have license reassignment rights, and in this case with the SQL Server OEM licenses, you don't have license reassignment rights. But if you do want license reassignment rights, you can add software assurance to this, and effectively that converts the product into a volume license for this product. So you get the VL license assignment rights, and because you've got software assurance, the other upside of this is that you now have the ability to move to SQL Server 2016 when that becomes available, because that will be within that time frame that software assurance applies. So for the customer there who are sort of saying, well, do we wait for 2016? We don't know what to do. Well, selling them this bundle and then adding software assurance to the bundle really can cover everything, because also knowing that you've got a new version of Windows Server becoming available this year, potentially there are two chances for you to attach volume license to the sale if required by the customer. So now, as we wrap up the rest of the recording, there's a series of events that are coming up. the ongoing continuation of the Modern Business for SMB Partners events, which are run by the Microsoft Australia Readiness team. The Safeguard Your Business events, which have been run through other cities, and the final event will be held in Perth on the 16th of February. And this covers topics such as, securing data inside and outside the organization, how to go through and leverage, some of the new security capabilities of Windows 10. There's Grow Efficiently around, how do you start taking advantage of some of these new technologies to give the customer more capabilities. And then finally, Business Anywhere, again in February, which goes through and covers off things such as, how do you get users to be productive and secure while they're working remotely? So with these events, they don't tend to focus on a particular product. Instead, these training days cover a range of different technologies. So they'll spend like an hour to an hour and a half on different technologies and sort of give you a bit of a broad view of some of the different solutions that are available that in this day and age, it's harder and harder to keep up with what's going on. So a lot of times these are things that people come along to just to sort of really find out what's going on outside of the sphere in which they work. Because if we're just exposed to one set of technologies all the time, that's really all we know how to use. And in this case, these days are really all around, exposing you to different things, how they work together, where you'd use one versus the other. So it really does give you a much broader view than a traditional type of training program. And then the way that you can register for these events is you just go to msevents.microsoft.com, you search for the event ID, you'll see that I've got the event ID listed alongside the event names there. So just do a search. Hopefully, if you are interested in attending and the dates work for you, hopefully the events that you want are still available. So these things can fill up quickly sometimes, so make sure that if you do need to register for one of these, that you jump on it as quickly as possible. So now we get to the end of the presentation where we talk about the resources. So the important one here is microsoftsmarthq.com.au. This is where you've probably received newsletters from this location. That's probably where you find out about this video. And it's the place to go to get information around, desktops, tablets, different types of touch devices, as well as the different server things that we generally focus on in these webinars. But it's this one location for Microsoft OEM resellers in Australia to gather around. The next one, the Microsoft Australia OEM team blog site. So this is the OEM and SMB focused information on Windows Server. So there's a lot of information up there already on SQL Server 2005 end of support. So go and take a look at that one. And then finally, we've got our OEM Server pre-sales information email alias. So if you contact us at oemserverau@microsoft.com. With this, you'll find that we try to get back to you as quickly as possible with this. So send through pre-sales questions. It could be something that involves OEM licensing, as well as the technical capabilities of products, and we'll get back to you as quickly as we possibly can.